Okay, we're a minute past the hour. We'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. I am Brian Fady, State Policy Associate with the Appliance Standards Awareness Project, also known as ASAP, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, let's start with a few quick housekeeping announcements. We are recording this webinar and making it available to all registrants within a few business days. We are also making these slides available to all registrants. To ask a question during the webinar, please add it to the Q&A feature on the bottom bar. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and you can upvote questions you think are particularly good or that you think we should prioritize. You can also talk with other attendees in the chat. Today, we're talking about a new energy efficiency and toxic waste reduction policy option for states called clean lighting. At its core, clean lighting is about accelerating the transition from fluorescent light bulbs to LEDs, thereby generating a host of savings that include increased energy efficiency, avoidance of carbon dioxide and other air pollutants, avoidance of mercury pollution, and savings on utility bills for consumers, businesses, and more. And we're very excited to have panelists today who have worked in the policy fields of toxic waste, product stewardship, and energy efficiency for decades. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker now, Michael Bender, Executive Director with the Mercury Policy Project. Michael has over 30 years of experience assisting governments to enact mercury reduction policies. In 1992, he co-founded and directed the North American Hazardous Materials Management Association. In 1998, Michael co-led the New England Zero Mercury campaign, which in 2005 broadened into a national NGO campaign to phase out mercury-added products and promote extended producer responsibility for product discards, such as mercury-added thermometers and lamps. Globally, he initiated a global NGO campaign in support of the adoption of the Minamata Convention on Mercury in 2017, and since then has assisted national governments in Africa and the Caribbean to phase out mercury-added products and expose the continued illegal sales of mercury skin lightening creams sold by online platforms such as eBay and Amazon. We're very excited to have Michael here today. I'm going to go ahead and begin the screen sharing. And Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk just very briefly about the benefit of LEDs and mainly focus on the risk of fluorescent lamps and why Vermont became the first state to ban them. Most of my presentation will be based on a Clean Lighting Coalition report I co-authored last year, which outlines the health and environmental risk of mercury use in lighting and the benefits of LEDs. The report link is presented in my last slide. Next slide, please. While other presenters will further elaborate on the superiority of LEDs, here's a brief overview. First, LEDs are far safer and much more efficient than fluorescent lights. They're less prone to breakage because their casings are often made of plastic, and if an LED does break, the material will not readily vaporize and expose people. The availability, price, and performance makes LEDs the most cost-effective and reliable lighting option in the United States today. Next slide. Fluorescent lamps contaminate the air, land, water, and people. Releases from lamp breakage may occur during use, when discarded, during collection and transportation, during recycling operations, and from landfills, incinerators, and other disposal practices. Due to the extremely low recycling rate of less than 30% of business lamps recycled and far less for households, most mercury lamps are haphazardly released. Next slide. Research from the state of Maine indicates that when a lamp is broken indoors, it can result in mercury vapors far in exceedance of state guidelines. Most at risk are infants and the developing fetus, who are more susceptible to developmental disabilities. After breakage, the Maine study found that mercury releases are likely to be elevated for at least 10 minutes, and toddlers are likely to experience the highest exposures. The study also showed elevated levels of mercury exposure when infants crawl over carpeting contaminated with mercury, and one recommendation is for the carpeting to be removed. Next slide. Vacuuming CFL debris can elevate mercury levels far in exceedance of the Maine Ambient Air Guidelines, MAG, and linger there for hours. The vacuum can be contaminated by mercury such that it cannot be easily decontaminated. Vacuuming and carpeting where a lamp is broken, even weeks after cleanup, can elevate the mercury readings over the MAG. Finally, it is unclear, according to the state of Maine, what the health risks are from low-level exposure, especially for sensitive populations. Next slide, please. Based on the latest scientific research, our study identified certain groups of most concern from exposure to mercury from lamp breakage. As I mentioned earlier, at the top of the list are sensitive populations, including the developing fetus, infants, children, and pregnant and breastfeeding women. Also at risk are people with underlying health conditions or those who are chronically exposed to a range of pollutants, who also become at greater risk. Next slide. As can be seen in this diagram, every time one vulnerability or exposure overlaps with another, the health risk is magnified. Even if the exposure to a toxic substance is well below the standard, mixed exposures of toxic substances have been demonstrated to induce health effects that any of the individual substances would not induce at such a low dose. Moreover, such effects are magnified in vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. As demonstrated in this slide, workers can be exposed to mercury throughout the life cycle of a lamp. The organs most affected by the inhalation of elemental mercury vapor are the brain and kidneys. Various studies have observed impaired neurobehavioral functions associated with long-term occupational exposure to mercury vapors at relatively low levels. Next slide, please. As Brian mentioned earlier, starting around the year 2000, the New England Zero Mercury campaign, and then subsequently the Multi-State Mercury Products campaign, worked with our NGO partners, mostly located in state capitals around the country, and in collaboration oftentimes with state and local government officials in promoting mercury-added product bans and extended producer responsibility initiatives requiring manufacturers to cover costs of collecting certain mercury-added products, including thermostats and lamps. Our campaign strategy relied on a tipping point strategy that focused on the point at which a slow, reversible change becomes irreversible, often with dramatic consequences. Next slide, please. Here is an example of how our campaign tipping strategy works. Before the campaign began, Honeywell and others were using over 14 tons of mercury per year to make thermostats. The campaign supported NGO efforts in several states, many of whom successfully adopted mercury thermostat bans. Click the slide, please, Brian. By 2006, Honeywell, the largest producer, responded to dwindling market and chaos in the market in managing and distributing by stopping production. Next click, please. Soon thereafter, the other producers did the same. By 2007, use was down to 3 tons of mercury per year, and the 2010 data showed virtually zero usage of mercury. Next slide, please. Next slide. So here's a brief snapshot of the state of Vermont mercury policies, as I was involved on the Governor's Advisory Committee on Mercury Pollution for 10 years in the early 2000s. First, in 1998, the first law in the nation was adopted requiring labeling of mercury-added lamps. Although it took 5 years to enact the law because the National Electrical Manufacturers Association brought the state of Vermont to court and eventually to the Supreme Court, their request was denied. Subsequently, lamps were labeled for all of North America. Secondly, a 2011 law established a policy for, quote, phasing out mercury lamps when technically and economically feasible mercury-free alternatives are available. In 2021, an NGO petition led by the Clean Lighting Coalition, VPIRG, and the Mercury Policy Project resulted in the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation banning sales of CFLs in 2023. Finally, a 2022 law passed earlier this year banned sales of 4-foot fluorescent lamps in Vermont starting January 1st, 2024. And I hope many states will follow. Last slide, please. Again, here's the link to our study, and afterwards I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Michael, so much. I will stop the screen share here, and we are going to move on to our next presenters. We have Jennifer Amen from ACEEE and Kanchan Swarup from ASAP. Jen is a senior fellow with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, where she develops and supports strategic directions for ACEEE's efforts to improve energy efficiency in homes and commercial buildings. Her current work focuses on maximizing energy savings from key building policies, including building codes, performance standards, and appliance standards, scaling up deep retrofits and building decarbonization, improving efficiency in indoor agriculture, and analyzing new opportunities for energy efficiency in the building sector. She also leads content development for ACEEE's consumer-focused website, Smarter House. And then Kanchan is the Technical Advocacy Associate with Appliance Standards Awareness Project, where she advocates for improved national efficiency standards for various appliances and equipment. She also conducts analysis and provides technical support for ASAP's state standards advocacy. Kanchan worked as a project engineer at Air Liquid before coming to ASAP in 2020. Jen and Kanchan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. Let me share my screen real quick. And I'm going to be talking about today about the findings of a study that Kanchan and a number of others from ACEEE and ASAP, including Brian and our co-authors, Joanna Maurer and Carolyn Tolentino, put out earlier this year, looking at really kind of taking a temperature of the market to see, could we really make the change, make the shift to all LED lighting in place of fluorescents. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the initial findings of our study on answering a few questions, and then I'll pass it over to Kanchan, and she'll get into the numbers in terms of energy, mercury savings, carbon reductions, cost savings, and so forth. So first, a little background. We approached this problem, I think, a lot along the lines that Michael was talking about, really recognizing that fluorescent light bulbs are out there. We continue to see significant sales in the market, even though LEDs have really come down in price, their performance has improved, and their efficiency is so good. But we know that fluorescents are really holding on to the market. They've got a grasp on portions of the market, and that these lamps contain mercury by design. They can't work without mercury. So we really need an alternative that can provide the energy and carbon savings that we've long worked for, but also those mercury reductions that are so important to the environment and human health. So our goal, of course, is to accelerate the transition of general purpose white light fluorescent LEDs and really to focus on the most common bulb types. So these are the linear fluorescents that are ubiquitous in office buildings, commercial spaces. You may have some in your basement or in a kitchen. In various diameters, so both the T5, T8, and T12 lamps, but also CFLs. And we're focused specifically on the pen-based CFLs. We've seen such a dramatic transition in the market for screw-based LEDs, replacing incandescents to some degree, but almost eliminating screw-based CFLs from the market. But we have in a lot of commercial buildings and in many homes, folks have dedicated CFL fixtures that come with a special socket and a ballast. And so these pin-based lamps that fit those fixtures, still do have a decent share of the market. So we wanted to include those in our work as well. So the big question as we started our work was, are LEDs ready to take over for fluorescents? And so our report answers some key questions about the lighting market, like, are replacement LEDs widely available? Are the replacements that are available simple drop-in replacements, or do they require rewiring or somehow changing the fixture? Those are really important questions for us as we dove into this research. And we really wanted to look and see what the availability was of what's called a type A LED, which is basically an LED that you can just pop into a fixture in place of the fluorescent that was there before. It uses the same ballast. It requires no rewiring. There are type B LEDs, which do require bypassing the ballast. So it's a relatively simple rewiring, but we know that any additional work is an additional barrier. So we're really focusing on those type A products. So are they widely available? Are there enough of them? Can people get their hands on them easily? Our second question was, how do these perform? How do these LEDs perform relative to CFLs, relative to linear fluorescents? Will folks be able to get the same or better performance from LEDs that they get from the fluorescent bulbs that they'll be replacing? What's the life cycle cost of these products relative to fluorescents? And finally, excuse me, what are the savings in terms of mercury, electricity, greenhouse gas, and savings to the end consumer, whether that be a residential consumer or a commercial building owner? And if you guys will bear with me, I'm just getting over a little bout of COVID, and so I'm still coughing a little bit. I'll try to get through this. So our first question on LED availability, we took a look at the market and we focused specifically on the Design Lights Consortium's database of LED products. Pardon me. My apologies. Brian, do you think you could take over? I'm really sorry.
Yeah, not a problem. I know from my bout of COVID, certainly coming back, the dry throat really gets you and sticks around for a while. So sorry that you're having to go through that. Well, we'll keep this going here. Jen was talking about LED availability and how in the report, the ACEEE ASAP report, we looked at the Design Lights Consortium database, which is a database used often by utility companies for energy efficiency programs. And we found in there over 30,000 models of LEDs being available. This was not an exhaustive tally of LEDs even because some models don't make it in this particular database for one reason or another. But it certainly proved there are many options available for consumers. You can see in the table on the right side, we've got just a few sizes and shapes of fluorescents and the LEDs that are available to replace them. You'll note the one big one kind of stands out about halfway down, the 21,000 there. That's for the 4-foot T8. It's by far the most common type of fluorescent light is the 4-foot T8. If you go into any office building or school or what have you, you look in the ceiling, it's going to be your 4-foot T8. And consequently, LED manufacturers have made the most replacement models in order to sort of capture that market. So there's certainly plenty of models available there as well. And let's see, Jen, you might have the slides. If you can do another slide here. Yeah, so this other question on availability was about ballast compatibility. And as Jen mentioned, what you're looking for is what's called a type A LED, which has been designed as a direct drop-in replacement. It's where all you have to do is take out the fluorescent, you put in the LED, you're good to go. It's the easiest hassle-free option. And so we took a look at ballasts that are out there, created a database of nearly 900 ballasts across 8 manufacturers. And we found a type A LEDs being available for 93% of the ballasts out there, which was really good to see. You might ask about the 7% remaining. You can use what's called a type B LED, where something called a ballast bypass takes place, but you can still use an LED within that ballast. We'll go to the next slide here. And so LED performance, a key question was, do LEDs have the same or better performance as the general purpose fluorescents that they would be replacing? And the short answer was yes. We found LEDs to have equivalent light output. They use half of the energy, creating a lot of energy savings there. LEDs have the same or better light quality with greater flexibility. They last 2 to 3 times longer than the fluorescents. And importantly, no mercury content in the LEDs. We'll jump to the next slide here. And this is sort of a, don't take our word for it kind of slide that, the same manufacturers who make fluorescents often make LEDs. And you can find they certainly make the case as well for the transition from fluorescents to LEDs. Here we have some marketing material from Philips talking about real pros say farewell to fluorescents and that their product is the ideal alternative to standard fluorescent tubes for all demanding lighting applications. And if you check out the ASAP ACEEE report, there are other examples from other manufacturers as well, really making the case for this transition to occur. And let's go to the next slide. I think it goes to Kanchan next. Yes, so Kanchan, I'll hand it over to you to talk about the savings analysis.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so as Jen and Brian mentioned, I'll be going into just a little bit of the methodology and results from our savings analysis for the farewell to fluorescent lighting report that we put out. So to address savings for purchasers and state and national impacts, we estimated annual savings through 2050 from a policy that would phase out linear fluorescent lamps and compact fluorescent lamps in 2023. So in order to do that, we calculated per unit energy savings based on input wattages for the fluorescent baseline lamps and the LED replacement. We estimated per unit incremental costs based on average prices of representative fluorescent and LED lamps from major retailers. And then we estimated future lamp shipments, accounting for the projected decline of fluorescent lamps over time. And then finally, we estimated the mercury content of each fluorescent lamp by averaging the reported mercury content from Philips, GE, and Sylvania lamps. From that, we calculated state-by-state electricity savings and costs by allocating national lamp sales into each state. And from the electricity savings, we determined state-level CO2 and mercury emissions reductions using state-by-state projected average power plant emissions rate through 2050. So we found that a full transition from fluorescent lights to LEDs would provide large mercury and CO2 emissions reductions. Total potential cumulative reductions of mercury in lamps shipped through 2050 would be about 16,000 pounds, and another 966 pounds of mercury would be avoided cumulatively through 2050 from power plant emissions due to just electricity savings. Annual carbon dioxide emissions in 2030 alone would drop by 18 million metric tons, and that's an amount equal to the annual emissions of 4 million typical passenger cars. And the total potential cumulative CO2 emissions reductions through 2050 would be 208 million metric tons, and that's equal to about how much 2 coal-fired power plants would emit over that same period of time. So almost half of the mercury reductions and CO2 emissions reductions come from 4-foot T8 lamps, and then 4-foot T12s provide the second largest reduction. But phasing out T5s, 8-foot lamps, and the pin-based CFLs would also result in significant reductions of mercury and CO2 emissions. And the contribution of the 4-foot T5 lamps to the potential CO2 emissions reductions is significantly larger than the contribution to the mercury reduction. And that's due in large part to the per unit energy savings for these lamps and their relatively low mercury content per lamp. So the transition to mercury-free LED lighting would also provide large utility bill savings for businesses and households. A school or municipal building may have hundreds of fluorescent lamps, and an office building may have hundreds to thousands, depending on its size. A household may have a couple of fluorescent lamps in a kitchen or a few in the basement or garage. We estimated the savings from replacing the fluorescent lamps in some typical buildings with LEDs and found that drop-in LED replacements for fluorescent lamps are very cost-effective for purchasers. For a typical school with around 980 fluorescent lamps, replacing the existing lamps with drop-in LEDs would save the school about $3,700 per year on electricity bills, and average life cycle cost savings would be more than $24,000. For a typical small office building with 240 fluorescent lamps, the annual electricity bill savings would be about $900, and then average life cycle cost savings would be more than $6,000. For a household kitchen with a 2-lamp fluorescent fixture, replacing the lamps with drop-in LEDs would reduce the household's annual electricity bill by about $5, but average life cycle cost savings would be about $50. So in our report, we estimated savings for all 50 states, and we also have detailed results by lamp type. If anyone is interested in learning more about the potential savings for individual states, feel free to download our report on the ACEEE website. We use 2023 as the assumed effective date in the report, but I think the recommendation would be for anyone who would introduce bills in the next year, it would be 2025 for the effective date. Much of our analysis is customizable though, so if you are interested in a customized savings report for your state with that updated effective date, please feel free to reach out to Brian and he'll have his contact info at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kanchan. Last but not least, for our presenters, I'd like to introduce Heidi Sanborn, the founding executive director of National Stewardship Action Council and Stewardship Action Foundation. Heidi has been an internationally recognized advocate for extended producer responsibility and a circular economy for over 20 years and has been in the industry for 32 years. She served as the first chair of the statewide commission on recycling markets and curbside recycling that started in 2020. And it resulted in 34 unanimous policy recommendations, many of which became law in this timeframe. And Heidi, I'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Brian. I'm very excited to share that actually that recycling commission, I had proposed one of the recommendations is to ban mercury containing lighting, and one of the recommendations then went on to become law, which is AB 2208, which we're going to talk about. So quickly, a little about our organization. We work nationally. We advocate for a circular and equitable economy. And to us, that means, well, I'll get into the details about what a circular economy is, but eliminating mercury in lighting was clearly one of them, as we've previous speakers have discussed. So I speak all over the world on producer responsibility, producers taking responsibility for the end of life of their products. And Michael Bender and I have been working together for over, I think, 20 years. Started back in the early 2000s, working on these mercury thermostats. So I've been doing this a long time, and I'm eager to share what we were able to accomplish. We have a board that's I'm very proud of, that all over the country, different types of businesses they represent, and also I think demographically representative, at least in large part of the country. And I hope everybody's working to diversify their boards as well. But I want to talk about circular economy and what it is, because people talk about that a lot and they don't really clarify what they mean. Nature is circular. Everything on this big marble, blue marble floating through space in the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, is in a closed loop system. Everything was designed, waste product from one thing is the feedstock for the next system. And we have interrupted that with waste. So the first thing under the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the definition of a circular economy is to design out waste and pollution. And pollution, to me, is toxics. Mercury is dangerous. And so even though it's a natural metal, it is also toxic, and we are putting it into products that are man-made, and that is disseminating it and causing a lot of problems. Then we keep materials in use and recycle them, and then we regenerate natural systems that we've harmed. But that's where I wanted to highlight. It's a 3-part test, and this is part 1. Get toxics out first. So when it comes to lighting, I wanted to just share in California, since 2006, we've had rules that have banned multiple hazardous products from disposal in the trash, fluorescent lamps being one of them. That created actual momentum from local governments to create the California Product Stewardship Council, which I was the founding director of and was with for 12 years. And then that led to the National Stewardship Action Council that I run now. By banning it from the trash, we call it a ban without a plan. It doesn't solve anything, especially when you have something like mercury, which is very expensive to manage and sequester, because we don't want it out there again. So it failed to address the releases during manufacturing, the breakage while in use or transport, and the end-of-life collection and recycling. I can tell you that in Sacramento County here, where I am, in California, they literally stopped promoting their lamp take-back program in the early 2000s because they had no more money to handle the lamps. They cost so much to manage, and that is just inexcusable. But we did ban the sale of mercury-containing thermostats in 2006. But when I formed the California Product Stewardship Council, the very first extended producer responsibility bill we passed in collaboration with Sierra Club was AB 2347 by Ira Ruskin, rest his soul. And that was to impose an EPR program on Mercury thermostats. And the good news is last year, we actually passed a bill to update that program. And we now have the highest rebate in the nation in California of $30 per Mercury thermostat. And there must be one location in every county and at least 90% of the residents within 15 miles of that location. And the manufacturers will no longer run the program. They've contracted with Product Care out of Canada. And so we think this is going to help us get what's left out there of the Mercury thermostats back quickly. But we did a slight cleanup bill this year to further refine and fix this because we couldn't negotiate it all last year. But long and the short of it is we've got the best bill in the nation on Mercury thermostats. And again, I had shared about the commission. We had to have unanimous votes. We had a broad group of stakeholders, including waste management companies like Waste Management and Republic and ENGOs and local governments, and they all supported banning the sale of products that are toxic and unnecessary and have safer alternatives. And that is mercury-containing lighting. So I want to thank, on the right is Assemblymember Ash Kalra, and on the left is Senator Josh Becker. So we had one member in each house to champion this bill, AB 2208, which is now the most comprehensive lamp ban in the country. And we would love to help you all achieve the same. I'm not going to show this, and that picture of me is weird, but the link is there. But we did a little promotional video with CLASP and others to promote this bill and why we were supportive of it. So if you'd like to use that or do something similar, please feel free to do that. And how do we get a bill like this, a ban on the sale of something passed? I will tell you, they are the hardest things to pass, is a ban. It's actually become harder to pass a sales ban on a product than it is an extended producer responsibility bill on a product. That's not a joke. That's a true story. The reason, at least in California, and I can tell you that we had 2 ban bills in California this year. This one, which passed, and another one on 1 pound propane gas cylinders, which failed. And I'll explain why. But this is how we got this one done. You have to expand your network to pass a ban bill. There are 2 primary parties in this country, and one of them does not like sales bans at all. They are just fundamentally opposed to them by nature. And so if there is literally any opposition, chances are good you will not get a bipartisan bill. So we got a broad group of supporters, which included folks from the team that typically don't like these bans. And that included manufacturers and businesses in California. Very, very important to do. We also got the unions, and the unions were important because they were protecting public health. That is a whole nother angle of our workers that are being exposed to these broken lamps in the waste management system. But what we did is first broaden our network. Then we start getting them all to call legislators, request meetings, send letters. We did social media posts, quite a bit of them. We wrote op-eds and articles. Some didn't even, the last one didn't get published actually yet. We were trying to get it published. But we had a whole lobbying toolkit put together, a fact sheet, a fact versus fiction sheet. Now, why do we need that? Because the opposite side always is promoting misinformation. So we're constantly doing fact versus fiction, fact versus fiction. You have to counter that misinformation or you can't get the bills done. We had detailed instructions on how to lobby, who to lobby, and who should be lobbying whom, because some groups are more effective at lobbying certain legislators for various reasons, and you have to know your legislature to do that. We provided sample emails, model sign-on letters, call scripts, talking points, social media content, how to find your legislator, believe it or not, some people don't know how, and then a Climate Action Now app. We got to work with them and they helped us with this bill. So this led to a lot of support. And you can see the variety of stakeholders here. This is not just environmental groups or toxics groups. It's waste haulers, it's businesses, it's lighting businesses, it's LED manufacturers in our state. That really started waking up those legislators. We testified, and we had a variety of testimony based on the committees and the people we were trying to sway in a hearing. We would not, put up somebody that wasn't going to actually win us a new vote. And I want to thank the Natural Resource Defense Council because they helped us pass this bill. Victoria Rome, their government affairs director, testified. Here she is in the hearing on the bill. And she said it will reduce the burden on local governments, which are left with the challenging and costly task of collecting and properly disposing of the lamps. The bill will also boost sales for more than 50 manufacturers and distributors of LED lighting that are operating in our state. That is very powerful testimony. And again, as I said, we got labor support. Our members manage waste and recycling materials every day, potentially exposing them to numerous risks. Mercury exposure from broken fluorescent lamps is an invisible yet very dangerous risk to their health. That was our Teamsters representative, John Bouchard. How did I get John Bouchard? He happened to serve with me on the commission, and I was just delighted he was willing to do this. But these people, I've been in these facilities many, many times, and they break everything that goes in the trash. There is no way we're not being exposed to mercury as long as it's in the waste stream. Now, how do we deal with who I was most worried about, which was the National Electronic Manufacturers Association, or NEMA. They make electronic equipment and the lighting. And I thought for sure on every other bill we've ever worked on with their products, they were very, very difficult. This time it was awesome. And I want to thank them very much publicly for their willingness to work with us. They told us that they had a problem with the ban in 2024 for a screw or bayonet based type compact fluorescent lamp. And we moved that out to 2025. So the pin based lamps were the ones that for some reason they cared the most about. And they even sent us this nice thank you letter, which we appreciated. So again, without their opposition, we were able to get this ban bill done. We did make some exceptions in the bill, including we heard from some researchers that were concerned that some of the lighting they use in specific research equipment or medical equipment would be at risk, and they didn't know if there were non-mercury alternatives. These are clearly not the largest volume of mercury lighting, and we didn't want to get into a shooting match with researchers or Stanford. As you can imagine, that would not be good, or with the medical research industry, because nobody wants to hold up anything in research institutions. So those are the exemptions, and I just wanted to make sure you could see them and have them for the record. So again, we were able to get it done. And we're very proud of it, and we're glad we were able to get the long lamps longer than up to 8 feet. So that's more comprehensive than was Vermont. Vermont laid the way, and we tried to one up, and hopefully somebody can one up us. But that's what we got in the bill. It's all the phase out by 2025 for everything, including the pin base with those exemptions and the up to 8 foot long lamps. And I would suggest that anytime you have a legislative champion, which you always need for a bill, thank them publicly. Make sure that they know how much you appreciate their willingness to do this. This is us. We have an annual awards ceremony for our legislative champions. This is Assemblymember Ash Kalra and his staff, Marissa Plant, who are absolutely fantastic on this bill. We couldn't have asked for better author and staff. And again, the awards are actually made from recycled glass and natural plants, but they really, really appreciate this, and we promoted them in that. So if you want to pass a bill, we're here to help. We'd love to help anybody around the country do this, or even in North America. I just got back from Canada last week. Feel free to join us, follow us on social media, and we're happy to help all of you do the same. Thanks so much. Happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Heidi. And now I'd like to bring all of our speakers back to take questions from the audience. Again, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. It's found in the bottom navigation bar there. And I'll get the speaker contacts up on the screen here as well. See here. And we'll go ahead and get started with some questions that have been coming in. I'll start with one that got the most upvotes here. It's about, is it better to use CFLs until they die, thereby embedding the mercury in the glass, or immediately replace with LEDs and take the CFLs to the hazardous waste collection?
Well, if I could start out on that, the mercury doesn't all get embedded in the CFL. That we know that based on the state of Maine Department of Environmental Protection breakage study, as I presented earlier, that a certain amount of it vaporizes, and also the example of the mercury breaking in a carpeted room, that material gets agitated and keeps on emitting. So as far as whether you should use them until they're spent, that's your call. I mean, based on what we know about the energy savings, I'd encourage businesses and offices to do major changeovers. If it's a household use, that's really up to you which way you want to go. Thanks.
Mhm. Great. And we have another question about fluorescent lamps. It says, I am sure my legislators will tell me the green cap on the tube ends means that the fluorescent is okay. Can that be addressed?
Well, I could take this one again, and we heard quite a bit from the industry on this. In particular, I think it's Philips that developed this so-called green end cap, essentially to fool the TCLP test. And I won't go into all that right now, but the point here is that the green end caps are not mercury-free. I was just looking up their mercury content. They're between, I think, 3.5 to 4 milligrams. And, it's just the industry, as I think Brian presented, is all in terms of supporting the changeover to the LEDs. And the other thing I just want to mention here is that to emphasize what Heidi said. I mean, in every other incident when we had NEMA, the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, whether it's thermostats, whether it has to do with labeling lamps, for 20 years, they've been in really very strong opposition to us. With NEMA's opposition going away, with giving them another year or two in certain areas, essentially we should be able to pass this legislation in most, if not all, the states in the US.
Following up there, there's a question, how many states have banned the sale of fluorescent lighting? Which states have banned the sale of fluorescent lighting?
Well, I think you just heard from the two that have, Vermont and California, and I appreciate California taking the next step. In Vermont, we had only banned the 4-foot fluorescents just because we were the first, and we were a little bit gun shy with NEMA and where they would come at us with all the variables when you look at the different types of linears and their diameters and all the potential complications. We did not know at that point that they were not going to be opposed. So what we did do in Vermont, though, was just through our DEC, I think we convinced them to ban the CFLs. Heidi, do you want to add anything there?
No, I just, every time we do a bill, we always try to push it a little bit further. So we'll just see how far we can go. I think now the key is keeping NEMA in support, because if they go south, it's going to be hard. And especially in less progressive states. I hate to say it, but that's the truth. Very, very difficult to get Republicans to support any of these ban bills. Very difficult.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is while California and Vermont are the only ones to ban the sales so far, it's an extension of existing Mercury regulations in states around the country, as you saw in Michael Bender's presentation. And certainly a number of states regulate fluorescent light bulbs because of their mercury content. They do it with disposal requirements or labeling requirements. There's even some mercury limitations in a couple of states. So this clean lighting idea is really a natural extension of those existing regulations. We got another question here. Jen, this might be for you. For the type B situation, that's where you'd probably do a ballast bypass to put the LED in. How much extra work and or cost is required for these replacements?
Sure. So I'm not really sure the cost. That's going to vary a lot depending on the labor costs. But basically, it's a matter of getting into the fixture and actually taking the wiring out of the ballast and wiring to the lamp. So there is a bit of wiring involved, ideally done by an electrician or somebody with some electrical skills. In most commercial buildings, you would have somebody with an electrician's license to do that. And, it could really add up if you're retrofitting an office or a building with a lot of lamps. But I think one of the things to keep in mind and that folks can bring into their calculations of this is how much longer the LEDs will last. So given their very long lifetime, that added upfront effort to do the ballast bypass might be a good, maybe a good return on investment. But of course, as we found, the vast majority of fixtures have ballasts that there are compatible type A lamps to work with. So in most cases, you can avoid that cost altogether.
Great. And let's see, we've got one question here. Why limit the ban to fluorescent and not include HID lamps, which I believe is high intensity discharge lamps, which are responsible for 15% of mercury content of lamps? This would be a consistent message and provide a reach for legislation. So even if not immediately adopted, it highlights society could be going further. Wonder if folks on the panel might want to take that one on HID lamp coverage.
Well, I can go first and maybe Heidi can follow again. I just think as we made a calculation to just target the 4-foot fluorescents, since we were the first state for the ban, that was just another calculation, being the first state. And Vermont's a small state. It doesn't have legislative staff. So it's all about, as Heidi was saying, relationships with legislators. And there were a number of other priorities with our natural resources committees, and we just wanted to keep it as straightforward and what we consider doable as possible.
Yeah, I mean, the more, I call it ornaments you hang on the tree, the more likely the tree is going to fall over. So you've got to be really careful and very strategic, and you've got to have people on the ground who know their legislature. And of course, we won't know next year's until after November 8th. So it's very important for you to really be aware of your politics and also of your stakeholders and who's got the most influence with the key, for example, environmental committee chairs or toxics committee chairs. If you don't get them on board, you're not getting these bills done. I'll tell you that. So you've got to make sure you've aligned your supporters and the powerhouse influencers with those key positions that are going to help get your bill. For example, it doesn't matter if you've got the wrong governor, they're not going to sign the bill. So it just depends, you've just got to look at your politics and decide where you're going to put your time and your energy based on the year you've got and the field you're on.
Could add to that. I would just say that It's also kind of just looking at the sheer magnitude of the market for fluorescent lamps. There are so many of them. They're just, ubiquitous in all types of buildings and applications. So I think relative to HID, where we are seeing, a lot of inroads for LED into the HID market, and also particularly in the commercial and industrial applications where those are used, I think, it's a little easier to make that case for individual owners to make that shift. Whereas when you have so many small commercial buildings, homes and others using fluorescent lamps, really trying to, get in there rather than trying to educate each and every one of those building owners and decision makers, getting started with fluorescents makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'll try to summarize. There was a few questions that came in along the same lines, and they're about the content of the LEDs that will be replacing fluorescents. And I think folks are looking for the panel to kind of respond to the idea of the end of life of the LEDs and how that might be treated, where things should go, and anything else to know about LED content there. Yeah.
I can talk on the political side, and let the technical people talk about the lamps specifically, but generally my hope is that every single product in this country that's sold is going to have a producer responsibility program by 2030. We have a problem of things coming to market that are dangerous, they're mislabeled, they're confusing to the public what to do with them, and that has to stop. And the only way we're going to get there is to have the producers be responsible for the end of life. Right now, they've externalized those costs onto the environment and the public sector and the ratepayers, and that is not sustainable, and it's not working because there's not enough money in the system to begin to cover the costs for things, especially like mercury containing products, as I mentioned earlier. So my hope is that everything is under a producer run system by 2030. And I know that other countries are going in that direction. Like Canada is very close. They just had Alberta, which is the most conservative of all the provinces, adopt EPR framework for packaging and all hazardous containing products October 3rd. So I think Canada is going to be there, and hopefully we're right behind them.
Yeah, and I totally would support that. And as Brian mentioned in my little bio there, the other wild card out there now are the Amazons and eBays of the world. And our international coalition really recently did a study on mercury, illegal mercury and skin lightening creams, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. So the other aspect is of addressing that is Section 230 of the Federal Act that allows these online platforms to act like newspapers rather than brick and mortar stores. So I totally agree with Heidi, but the challenges, unfortunately, are getting bigger rather than smaller.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much. We're hitting the bottom of the hour here, so I'll just throw on the screen here one more time contact information for the panelists here. And of course, feel free to reach out with follow-up questions afterward. California and Vermont were two states that adopted a clean lighting policy this year, but we're certainly hoping that they will not be the last, and that many states will be interested in a clean lighting policy for their state as well in the coming year. And if that's something of interest to you, please feel free to reach out. So I want to thank our panelists again and remind that a recording of the webinar as well as the slides will be sent out to all registrants via email in the coming days. Thank you again, everyone.